Black Maid's daughter greeted Korean Mafia boss's mother. Her Busan Dialect greeting had every guest frozen. The entire grand ballroom went silent. Ezra Grimes, the most feared American Korean Mafia boss on the East Coast, had just watched his elderly mother freeze mid-step. All because of her. All because of Laura. The black child everyone overlooked, everyone ignored, everyone dismissed as just another staff member's kid. Until she opened her mouth and spoke in a Busan dialect so pure, so authentic, it transported the old woman back to the docks of her youth. They thought she was nothing. They thought she was invisible. They were wrong. The Grimes estate's gleaming marble ballroom might as well have been a battlefield. Designer gowns and platinum jewelry couldn't hide what these people truly were: killers, money launderers, power brokers. The Grimes family didn't build their empire on kindness. They built it on blood and the ruthless efficiency of their Seoul, New York pipeline. And now the matriarch, Miss Rose, had finally emerged from semi-retirement in Busan to inspect her son's American operations, bringing with her expectations heavy enough to crush steel and a reputation that made grown men lower their eyes. Esther Jenkins knew the weight of expectations. At 32, she'd spent a lifetime being underestimated. Too black for Korea, too Korean for America. A woman caught between worlds, belonging fully to neither. Her daughter Laura, at 6 years old, was already learning the same impossible dance. The household staff had received strict instructions that morning. Be invisible, be silent, be nothing, just another black face in a service uniform. Just another woman to be ignored. Keep your head down, don't make eye contact, speak only when spoken to, and for God's sake keep your children out of sight. The irony wasn't lost on Esther. These were the same instructions her foster mother had drilled into her on the streets of Busan when she was 8 years old, newly arrived from a failed adoption, living in the margins of a city that didn't know what to make of her. The same rules for survival in two countries separated by an ocean, but united in their expectations of invisibility. The staff meeting that morning had been a masterclass in fear. Mr. Chen, the head of household, had sweated through his expensive shirt as he paced before the assembled domestic workers. Miss Rose Grimes built half the Busan operations before her son was even born. She doesn't visit properties, she inspects them. She doesn't overlook mistakes, she eliminates the people who make them. Today she honors us with her presence for the annual gala. Any error, any disrespect, any hint of poor service, and your employment won't be the only thing terminated. Am I understood? Esther had stood at the back of the servants' hall, silent, watching, always listening. The other staff avoided her gaze. The Korean staff especially kept their distance. The black woman who spoke their language too well, who'd lived in Busan, who knew their customs, she made them uncomfortable. She was an anomaly they couldn't categorize, couldn't understand. Their whispers followed her through the service corridors. Why does she know our songs? Where did she really come from? Why does Mr. Grimes allow her to stay? Miss Rose's arrival had transformed the estate into a fortress. Security men with earpieces and bulges under their tailored suits positioned themselves at every entrance. The guest list was vetted 3 times. The catering staff was searched. Every flower arrangement was inspected. Esther moved silently through the preparations, polishing silver, arranging place settings, making everything perfect. Her hands didn't shake. They never shook anymore. Not since that night in Busan 15 years ago when everything burned and she'd grabbed 6-month-old Laura from the foster home just before the authorities arrived. She was assigned to back corridor duty only, away from the ballroom, away from Miss Rose, away from danger, away from recognition. Mr. Chen had made sure of that. You stay in the service areas, he'd snapped at her. No main rooms, no guest interaction. If Miss Rose sees you, he didn't finish the thought. He didn't have to, but fate has a way of mocking our best precautions. A spilled drink in the children's playroom. A door left open by a careless guard. And suddenly, Laura was running through the hallway, chasing a ball that had rolled away from the staff quarters, her little feet padding across marble floors she was never supposed to touch. Esther's heart stopped when she heard the sound, Laura's bright laughter echoing through the corridor that led directly to the ballroom's entrance. She dropped the tray she was carrying and ran, her sensible shoes silent on the marble, her mind racing through every terrible possibility. But she was too late. The ballroom's massive double doors were open for the pre-dinner cocktail hour. The city's elite mingled with champagne glasses and predatory smiles, and there, framed in the doorway like a painting of innocence interrupting evil, stood Laura. Her simple cotton dress, the nicest thing Esther could afford, but still clearly marking her as staff family, stood in stark contrast to the designer gowns surrounding her. Her hair was pulled back in neat braids. Her wide eyes took in the glittering chandelier above. And directly in front of her, turning from a conversation with her son, stood Miss Rose Grimes. The matriarch was smaller than the legends suggested, but her presence filled the entire doorway. Her traditional hanbok, modernized with Western tailoring, spoke of someone who bridged worlds with absolute authority. Her silver hair was pulled back in an elegant chignon. Her jade necklace, a family heirloom worth more than most people's houses, caught the light. Her eyes, cold and calculating, landed on Laura with the weight of 40 years of command. The room began to quiet, conversations dying as people noticed the interruption. Ezra Grimes turned, his expression darkening as he saw the child who shouldn't exist in this space. Laura looked up at Miss Rose, and Esther, frozen in the doorway behind her daughter, watched in horror as Laura did exactly what Esther had taught her to do when meeting Korean elders. Laura bowed, not the awkward American approximation, a perfect, respectful bow, hands clasped, head lowered at precisely the right angle, the kind taught in Busan homes to children who understand the weight of tradition. And then Laura spoke. But it wasn't just the words. It was the accent, the specific regional cadence of the Busan docks, the gritty, soulful dialect that hadn't been spoken in the Grimes household since Miss Rose left Korea 40 years ago, the exact pronunciation that belonged to families who'd worked the fish markets for generations, who'd survived wars and poverty through sheer determination and family bonds that transcended everything else. The ballroom went silent, deathly silent. The kind of silence that precedes violence. Miss Rose's champagne glass froze halfway to her lips. Her eyes widened, not with anger, but with something far more dangerous. Recognition. Ezra Grimes stepped forward, his hand instinctively moving toward the weapon he always carried. His security detail tensed, but Miss Rose raised one trembling hand, stopping everyone in place. She stared at Laura as if seeing a ghost. Her lips moved, forming words in the same Busan dialect, her voice shaking. "Where did you learn this?" Laura, oblivious to the tension, smiled with the pure confidence of a child who'd been taught something beautiful and wanted to share it. "My mom taught me when we lived in Busan." Miss Rose's cane, dragon-headed, gold-tipped, a symbol of her authority, trembled against the marble floor. And Esther, still frozen in the doorway, watched her entire carefully constructed life of invisibility shatter like crystal against stone, because Miss Rose was now looking past Laura, directly at her, with eyes that held a question that could destroy everything or save everything. "Who are you?" The Grimes estate was a cathedral of blood-stained power, a mausoleum of marble where the elite gathered to trade in secrets and ironclad expectations. Inside the grand ballroom, the air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the low-frequency hum of men who had built their empire on blood. Esther, moving with the perfect invisibility of a woman who knew the survival rules of the underworld, kept her head down as she polished crystal, unaware that her shroud of safety was about to be torn away. In the shadows of the service corridor, 6-year-old Laura had found a stray ball, a splash of color in a world of monochromatic violence. She chased it through a door left ajar by a careless guard, stepping out of her staff quarter sanctuary and into the battlefield of the gala. The rhythmic, hollow tap of a dragon-headed cane suddenly silenced the orchestra, and the Iron Lady of the Seoul, New York pipeline, Miss Rose, appeared like a hurricane made flesh. The collision was inevitable. Miss Rose looked down with ice in her veins, her gaze a blade through silk that demanded submissive silence from everyone it touched. But Laura did not tremble. She had been raised in the multicultural foster communities of Busan, where respect was a surgical miracle of tradition. To the horror of her mother watching from the wings, Laura dropped into a perfect 90-degree bow, her small hands folded with a pure, unadulterated dignity that shouldn't exist in a child so far from Korea. To serve with honor is to find honor in serving. "Respected elder," Laura said, her voice small but carrying a Busan dialect so ancient and pure it felt like a jagged rasp of truth slicing through the room's pretension. The deathly silence that followed was heavy enough to crush steel. Ezra Grimes stood paralyzed, watching the clenched-jawed shock on his mother's face as the girl's gritty, rhythmic greeting resurrected a ghost buried for 40 years. Miss Rose's dragon-headed cane froze mid-tap against the marble, her mechanical indifference shattered by a linguistic root of truth she hadn't heard since her sister's lineage was thought lost to a seaside fire. The Iron Lady didn't see a maid's daughter, she saw a biological bridge to a forgotten heritage. In that surgical moment, the forbidden bow didn't just break the gala's etiquette, it signaled a total systemic collapse of the lie Esther had spent a lifetime protecting. The deathly silence of the ballroom was shattered not by a gunshot, but by the rhythmic, hollow tap of Miss Rose's cane as she began to walk toward Esther, who had collapsed to her knees in a desperate attempt to shield Laura. The atmosphere of terror that usually surrounded the Grimes family intensified as Ezra stepped forward, his tattooed chest tensing with a lethal suspicion. He looked at the black maid he had overlooked and dismissed for years, seeing her now not as a shadow, but as a strategic pawn in a game he didn't yet understand. "Where did she learn that dialect, Esther?" Ezra's voice was a low-frequency hum of controlled violence. Esther's hands shook as she looked up, her survival rules failing her for the first time. She realized the shroud of safety she had built in America was gone, and the only way out was through the jagged rasp of truth. Under the unwavering attention of the Iron Lady, Esther began to speak of the back alleys of Busan and the multicultural foster community, where she had hidden after escaping a seaside fire that everyone believed had left no survivors. She described a rainy afternoon in a small apartment where Laura had been raised by the ghosts of the Grimes lineage, learning the proper way to address elders and the soulful cadence of a family she was never supposed to meet. Miss Rose listened with narcissistic blindness, replaced by a raw human vulnerability, her eyes searching Laura's face for the biological bridge to her own lost sister. The irony wasn't lost on Ezra. The invisible staff member he had ignored was the keeper of his family's sacred history. "They told me the seaside house burned with everyone inside," Miss Rose whispered, her voice a fragile contrast to her usual absolute authority. Esther reached into her pocket and pulled out a clandestine connection to that past, a scorched, jade-colored pendant that matched the one hanging from Miss Rose's own neck. The revelation was a surgical miracle that rewrote the systemic rules of the Grimes empire. Esther and Laura weren't just disposable staff. They were the protected heart of a dynasty built on blood and forgotten promises. The Iron Lady of the Seoul, New York pipeline did not wait for permission. Miss Rose turned away from the stunned gala guests, her dragon-headed cane leading the way toward her private quarters, a gilded trap of mahogany and ancient memories. With a mechanical indifference that ignored Ezra's protests, she gestured for Laura to follow, while Esther was held back by the dragon guard, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Inside the inner sanctum, the atmosphere of terror shifted into something far more intimate and poignant. Miss Rose sat in a high-backed chair, her ice-veined gaze softening as she looked at the little girl who possessed the Busan dialect so ancient and pure. This was the matriarch's test, a surgical miracle of interrogation designed to uncover the root of truth. She didn't ask about names or dates. Instead, she hummed a low, rhythmic melody, a forgotten lullaby from the seaside docks that had been buried for 40 years. Laura didn't hesitate. Her voice, small and soulful, picked up the tune, adding the specific, gritty inflections unique to the Grimes' original coastal village. It was a biological bridge that no spy could fake. The girl began to sing words about seaside fires and rising tides, folk songs that Esther had whispered to her in the back alleys of Busan to keep their history alive. The Miss Rose's mechanical indifference finally experienced a total systemic collapse. Tears, carving tracks through her sophisticated mask, began to fall as she realized this child was indeed the unwitting heir to a legacy she thought had been erased as a loose end. Outside the doors, Ezra stood with his tattooed chest tensing, listening to the impossible harmony of the old woman and the maid's daughter. The test was over, but the lethal suspicion of the underworld was only just beginning to stir. Miss Rose reached out a trembling hand and touched Laura's cheek, recognizing the pure, unadulterated dignity of her own blood. The Iron Lady had found her protected heart, and the survival rules of the Grimes mansion were about to change forever. Ezra Grimes stood in the shadows of the study, his tattooed chest tensing as he watched the unlikely duo through the glass. While his mother saw a biological bridge to the past, Ezra saw only a strategic pawn, or a lethal plant sent by the Silas Syndicate to destabilize his absolute authority. His narcissistic blindness prevented him from seeing the truth. To him, Esther's shroud of safety was nothing more than a cover for a calculated risk. "I want them monitored," Ezra commanded his dragon guard, his voice a low-frequency hum of controlled violence. He poured himself a glass of vintage whiskey, the amber liquid shimmering under the shivering light of the chandelier. He was ready to treat them as disposable staff, once more, his mechanical indifference masking the immigrant's trauma that made him distrust everyone. Suddenly, a small hand reached out, untugging at his expensive fabric sleeve. Laura was standing there, her pure, unadulterated dignity clashing with the atmosphere of terror Ezra projected. She didn't use her perfect Busan greeting this time. Instead, she used a maid's observation, a skill honed by watching her mother survive in the back alleys. "Don't drink that, Uncle," she whispered in the gritty, rhythmic cadence of the docks. Ezra froze, his blade-like gaze dropping to the girl. The man with the shaking hands who brought the tray, he didn't use the proper way to serve the elder. She pointed to a microscopic, oily film on the surface of the drink, a detail Ezra, blinded by his own sophisticated mask, had completely overlooked and dismissed. Ezra dipped a silver stir rod into the glass. It turned a corrosive black instantly. So the lethal stasis of the room shattered as his dragon guard moved to intercept the waiter, but Ezra's focus remained on the 6-year-old girl in the simple cotton dress. The dragon's suspicion experienced a total systemic collapse. In that surgical moment, he realized Laura wasn't a threat. She was the invisible guard he didn't know he had. His ice-veined heart felt the first crack of humanity as he realized his empire's survival now rested on the maid and her daughter. The news of the Black Pearl in the Grimes mansion spread through the underworld like a low-frequency hum of impending disaster. In a dimly lit boardroom across the city, the leaders of the Silas Syndicate studied a graining surveillance photo of Laura, the biological bridge that threatened to unify the Grimes' fractured claim to the Busan docks. To them, she was not a child, but a strategic pawn that needed to be erased to ensure Ezra's total systemic collapse. They knew that the Iron Lady would do anything to protect this protected heart, making the girl the perfect calculated risk for a coup. Inside the estate, the atmosphere of terror shifted from internal suspicion to external lethal power. Ezra had discarded his narcissistic blindness after the poisoning attempt, replacing it with a titanium grip on the mansion's security. He no longer saw Esther and Laura as disposable staff, but as the root of truth for his family's survival. Yet, even with his Dragon Guard on high alert, the Silas Syndicate launched a surgical strike that bypassed the Mausoleum of Marble's main gates. The rising storm broke during the hour of shivering light just before dawn. The first window exploded inward in a symphony of lead, shattering the gilded trap's facade. As the Dragon Guard moved to engage the invaders, Ezra found himself pinned in the library, his tattooed chest tensing as he realized the primary target wasn't his life. It was the girl. The Silas attackers moved with mechanical indifference, their red laser sights painting the walls as they searched for the 6-year-old girl in the simple cotton dress. Esther moved with the street hustle instinct of a woman who had survived the back alleys of Busan. She grabbed Laura, pulling her into a shroud of safety within the invisible pathways of the house, the service tunnels and narrow vents that Ezra and his guards had always overlooked and dismissed. While the Cathedral of Cold Violence erupted into a blood-stained battlefield, Esther became the invisible guard, navigating the darkness with a blade-like focus. She was no longer just a maid. She was the only wall standing between the protected heart and the ruthless cynicism of a syndicate that wanted her daughter dead. In the aftermath of the breach, the Mausoleum of Marble was no longer a fortress. It was a sieve. Ezra's Dragon Guard had been trained for blood-stained power and frontal assaults, but they were blind to the invisible pathways and the shadowed corridors where the real work of the house was done. Recognizing this total systemic collapse of security, Esther stepped into the vacuum of authority, her street hustle instinct replacing the submissive role she had played for years. Esther gathered the other women, the cleaners, the laundresses, the disposable staff who lived as ghosts in the Grimes estate. In the floral-scented warmth of the laundry room, away from the lethal stasis of Ezra's command center, she organized the first clandestine intelligence network. They were the eyes and ears that had always been overlooked and ignored, and now they would become the mansion's invisible guard. "They see us as nothing," Esther whispered, her voice a jagged rasp of truth that bound the women together in a shroud of safety. "But we know which floorboards creak, which service elevators are bugged, and which security men have been taking clandestine calls in the garden." With mechanical indifference to the danger, the women began a surgical mapping of the house's vulnerabilities, on creating a biological bridge of information that bypassed Ezra's narcissistic blindness. While Ezra prepped for a fierce showdown, Esther's network identified the strategic pawns of the Silas Syndicate already hiding within their own walls. They didn't use silenced gunshots or cold steel. They used the tools of their trade, a misplaced tray, a maid's observation, and the rhythmic hollow tap of signals passed through the vents. Laura sat in the center of this inner sanctum, her pure, unadulterated dignity serving as the root of truth that kept the women focused. The Black Pearl was no longer just a target. She was the commander of a shroud of silence that would determine who survived the rising storm. The traumatic silence following the Silas attack was broken not by an order from Ezra, but by a ceremonial summons from the matriarch's private wing. Miss Rose emerged into the shattered ballroom, her dragon-headed cane striking the marble with an absolute authority that commanded every guard to holster their weapon and every disposable staff member to freeze. She moved toward Laura, her Iron Lady facade replaced by a raw human vulnerability that sent a ripple of sheer cold terror through the guests who understood the gravity of what was about to happen. In front of the assembled underworld, Miss Rose reached into a small velvet box, pulling out a traditional Korean hairpin carved from ancient jade, the Iron Lady's gift. It was a piece of sacred history that belonged only to the direct Busan lineage, a biological bridge that proved Laura was the unwitting heir to the Grimes' most secret power. With mechanical indifference to the gasps of the Silas spies, Miss Rose pinned the jade into Laura's hair, her ice-veined voice carrying the weight of a total restoration of the family line. "This child carries the blood of the seaside docks," Miss Rose declared, her gaze a blade through silk that swept across the room. "She is no longer a shadow. She is the Black Pearl of the Grimes dynasty, and she is untouchable." The gesture was a surgical miracle of diplomacy. By labeling Laura as sacred, Miss Rose had turned the Maid's daughter into a strategic pawn that no one dared strike without inviting the total systemic erasure of their own house. Ezra watched from the shadows, his tattooed chest tensing, as he realized his mother had just committed them to a fierce showdown from which there was no retreat. The rising storm was no longer a local conflict. It was now a war for the root of truth. As Laura stood with pure, unadulterated dignity, the jade in her hair catching the shivering light, Esther felt the icy pressure of the target on her daughter's back grow even larger. The Iron Lady had given them a crown, but in the cathedral of cold violence, a crown was often just a gilded trap for those who weren't ready to bleed for it. The rising storm finally broke with a total systemic collapse of the mansion's outer defenses as the Silas Syndicate launched their final, desperate assault. The mausoleum of marble erupted into a battlefield where designer suits were traded for tactical gear and cold steel. As the front gates were breached with a symphony of lead, Ezra Grimes found himself pinned by a surgical strike designed to isolate the Black Pearl from her dragon guard. "They're in the vents," Esther realized, her street hustle instinct overriding the atmosphere of terror paralyzing the other staff. She knew the cathedral of cold violence better than the men who owned it. She knew the invisible pathways and service tunnels that were never included in Ezra's high-tech security maps. While the Iron Lady, Miss Rose, stood her ground with pure, unadulterated dignity, Esther grabbed her daughter and the matriarch, pulling them into the shadowed corridors. The siege of the fortress turned into a high-stakes game of invisible warfare. Esther led them through the Maid's routes, the narrow and damp passages behind the laundry and the kitchen where the disposable staff had lived as ghosts for decades. Above them, the rhythmic hollow tap of gunfire echoed through the floorboards, but Esther moved with a blade-like focus, navigating the gilded trap with the precision of a seasoned commander. When a Silas assassin intercepted them in the narrow boiler room, Esther didn't rely on blood-stained power. Using a surgical maneuver learned in the back alleys of Busan, she used the environment against him, triggering a steam vent that blinded the attacker in a cloud of white heat. Miss Rose watched in clenched-jawed shock, finally seeing that Esther was the most lethal protector in the house. They emerged into the shivering light of the garden, safely past the primary kill zone. And Esther signaled Ezra's loyalists through the clandestine intelligence network she had built, allowing the Dragon Guard to flank the invaders. The Maid had saved the monsters, turning a calculated risk into a surgical miracle of survival. The root of truth was now undeniable. The Grimes Empire lived because the invisible had chosen to see. The symphony of lead finally faded into a traumatic silence as the last of the Silas Syndicate's mechanical indifference was purged from the Grimes estate. The cathedral of cold violence stood scarred, but the root of truth had been firmly planted in the debris. Ezra Grimes, his tattooed chest tensing with the weight of a hard-won victory, stood in the center of the ruined ballroom and did something the underworld never expected to see. He bowed. The bow was not directed at a rival boss or a strategic pawn, but at Esther, the woman who had transformed from disposable staff into the invisible guard that saved his lineage. "You saved my mother. You saved our history," Ezra stated, his voice a low-frequency hum that carried the weight of absolute authority. With a surgical precision, he declared a total restoration of the family charter. Esther and Laura were no longer ghosts in the staff quarters. They were officially recognized as the protected heart of the Grimes dynasty. Miss Rose stepped forward, her dragon-headed cane tapping softly on the marble as she